Welcome to Virtual LLF 2021. My name is Aijazuddin. I'm an art historian, but I'm completely overshadowed by the person whom I'll be interviewing this morning, and that is Sunita Kohli. Sunita Kohli is a national award-winning interior designer, architectural conservationist, and furniture manufacturer since 1971. So that means she's been in the business for 50 years. Her professional portfolio includes several significant public and heritage buildings, libraries and museums in New Delhi and Bhutan, hotels and hotel boats in Egypt, and residences in India and abroad. She's been a former chairperson of the School of Planning and Architecture in Bhopal and a National Institute of Excellence. And in 1992, she was honored with the Padma Shri by the President of India. Incidentally, she's the only interior designer ever to receive this honor, either before or afterwards. Long before COVID-19 hit us, when all of us took to cooking, she had co-authored the Lucknow cookbook with her mother. She's the foremost authority on Edwin Lutyens and his architectural contribution to New Delhi. She, between 85 and 89, and on a number of occasions afterwards, she was responsible for the restoration and the renovation of both the Rashtrapati Bhavan and Hyderabad House, which is the official entertainment venue by the Ministry of External Affairs. Sunita, welcome. And I can't tell you what a privilege it is to be able to cross the border like this virtually and to interact with you. When I grow up, Sunita, I want to be like you. But meanwhile, can we have the presentation by you? Because I think you are the living authority on Edwin Lutyens' work and contribution to New Delhi. So over to you, Sunita.
Thank you so much, Aijaz, for those very, very kind words. And thank you, Iman, and thank you, Razi, for inviting me to the Lahore Literary Festival. I'm, of course, delighted because I was born in Lahore and then I grew up in Lucknow. So that's another delight. So I think that for the subject today, which is Lutyens and the creation of Delhi, it might be pertinent to begin with a short history of architectural buildings in British India. Theirs was a story of constant experimentation with several building styles, and ever since they had first come in 1600 AD. But there never had been a definitive imperial style, and the quest for one had always engaged the British throughout their time in India. In the early years, buildings were fundamentally commercial, and these were built by usually by either by amateur architects or by military engineers who used to use pattern books as prototypes. But however, in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it was acknowledged by the British that historically in India, power was recognized by its outward expression, and that the greatness of a civilization was best expressed in its architecture. So there were three cities where building activity was taking place, and these were these were Calcutta, Madras, and Karachi, and Bombay in the west. And in Madras, now called Chennai, there was a lot of sort of indigenous architecture with exotic experimentations in Indo-Saracenic architecture, which was also being done in provincial capitals like Lahore and Lucknow. The other place where there was a lot of activity was Calcutta. This is Government House, built in 1799, the first important British building in India. And this was based on Kedliston Hall, which was the seat of Lord Curzon. And therefore, he always said in his book that it was his divine right to have been Viceroy of India.
Preordained.
Preordained, exactly. So, and in Bombay, the buildings were very Gothic and Ruskinian. And as you see in both these major buildings, which are still very much used today. But the story of New Delhi really begins in the Delhi Darbar of 1911. Here, it was the King George V had proclaimed that that the capital would move from Calcutta to New Delhi. And so there were many people who were very vociferous against them, including Lord Curzon, who was had been the viceroy from 1895 to 1897 to 1905. Delhi was selected because it had ease of access and it was equidistant from Karachi, Calcutta, and Bombay. Lord Curzon was very vociferous against this plan because firstly, it was going to be paid by the Indian taxpayer, and secondly, he did not approve of it. But I have to say that the Indian population as a whole was very much against this plan, particularly in Calcutta, because now they thought that this capital city would be reduced to a provincial capital and not be the capital of British India. And for generations, Delhi had been the Mughal capital of India, and this did not please a section of the Hindu population. But however, what pleased everybody was that according to tradition, every dynasty that had established its capital in Delhi, by establishing the capital, it presaged the demise of that dynasty. So that was something that everybody had in common. Now, how did Lutyens come into the picture? He came in because the then president of the Royal Institute of British Architects, Sir Reginald Blomfield, recommended Lutyens. And why did he recommend Lutyens? Because there was a large body of his work which was already very, very well known throughout England. So he had done country houses, he had done Castle Drogo, Lindisfarne Castle, these houses, Union Buildings in Victoria, and the British Pavilion in Rome in 1910. And so his work was very well known. And in fact, it is said of him that during that period, every Edwardian gentleman of means wanted the house to be designed by him and the gardens by Gertrude Jekyll, who was the best known landscape designer of her times. But Lutyens, I have to say, was, though born in 1869, and he was relatively young when he was commissioned to design Delhi, both the principal buildings and the city. He was very indifferently educated, and he always felt the lack of it, but he also always told his children that perhaps his originality of mind came from the fact that he wasn't educated as an architect, but he was known to be a natural mathematician, and mathematics came to him as naturally as perhaps perfect pitch comes to some people. Here I have to mention that in 1924, when he designed the Midlands Bank, this shows a wonderful adaptive reuse of an old legacy building, because today it's a very stylish hotel called the Ned. And Ned was Lutyens's pet name. And it's really quite amazing. I mean, this photograph of the walls I took, that the walls have now been converted into a very, very stylish club.
Mm.
So Lutyens, government set up Delhi Town Committee, Planning Committee in 1913, and Lutyens was established or confirmed as the architect also later that same year. They were asked to, at the Viceroy's express request, they were asked to go to Jaipur and to Agra to look at, Hindu and Muslim architecture or Mughal architecture. And Lutyens was impressed by neither. And he had very disparaging things to say about both these things because he wrote a recipe of Hindu and Muslim architecture to Baker. And here I should mention that Lutyens met Baker when he was 18. Baker was his senior, but Lutyens had been apprenticed to a very well-known architect of those times, Ernest George in London. And when Baker met him, he recollects in his memoirs that he just seemed to be joking his way through the 6 months he spent there. And he said, but each one of us realized that he knew some eternal truths about our art that we were yet to discover. So, of course, Baker later on became his collaborator.
And Sunita, can I just intervene for 1 second?
Yes.
Since we're talking about William Baker, he was introduced by the then Viceroy, to the Viceroy by Swinton Jacob. And he was described as a man who's a successful architect and speaks not only like a poet, but like a statesman. So it was an interesting insight into the man's character as such. Please continue.
No, and here I must say that Lutyens always felt the lack of, being as well educated as Baker, because it is said of Lutyens that he was in a sense inarticulate, excepting when he was writing letters to his wife, which are now, fortunately, 2,500 of them are on loan to the Royal Institute of British Architects by Jane Ridley, or his articulation was at the end of a pencil because he designed something every day ever since he began. So now for laying out of this plan of New Delhi, Lutyens was deeply influenced with what Lafont had done with Washington and the plan of Versailles and also vistas in Rome. And Lord Hardinge, who was then Viceroy of India from 1910 to 15, Lutyens always said that he was the father of the equilateral and the hexagonal plan, according to which these 32 acres, which comprises New Delhi, have been laid out. So here we see what was then called Kingsway. It's Rajpath with the Rashtrapati Bhavan flanked by the Secretariat buildings. Then this is Rajpath, comes to India Gate and the memorial, and it's the central access to Purana Killa. So one was an access to Purana Killa and interestingly laid on Mughal geometry, the whole plan. And one was to Purana Killa, the central axial view, and the other was to Jama Masjid. Of course, Hindu architecture, he thought, had all these terrifying sculptures carved onto them. So, as I said, he was disparaging, but he went on later, as we will see, to incorporate many of these elements. Of course, he was familiar with Humayun's tomb, which is the precursor for the Taj Mahal. And so once the plan of New Delhi had been set, then arose the question of style. And as I said earlier, a definitive imperial style had never been established in Delhi. So King George V was very much in favor of Mughal architecture, and to which Lutyens had said, fancy Shakespeare being asked by Elizabeth, meaning of course Elizabeth I, to what being asked to no, fancy Shakespeare being asked by Elizabeth to write an ode in Chaucerian meter. And Harding, who was very much in favor of the pointed arch, to which Lutyens said that he wrote to Baker and said, I would like to ask him, meaning Harding, to what country does the rainbow belong? He said God did not tinker with the round arch, and he did not make the eastern rainbow pointed just to show his wide sympathies. So he was always writing off these missives, and that's how we get to know a lot about what was going on in his mind, because he was a letter writer. You know, the greatness of a civilized best expressed in its architecture. So they wanted to also establish empire in stone, and therefore the grandeur, the massiveness that you know, the principal buildings have in New Delhi, designed both by Lutyens and by Baker. Now it is, as I said, he wrote several letters to his wife, and we, you know, architectural historians are fortunate that these exist, because these tell us what was happening in his mind through 19 voyages that he made to complete this greatest task that he was ever given. And in one of his letters, he wrote, and I quote, "To express modern India in stone, to represent her amazing sense of the supernatural, cannot be done by the almost sterile stability of the English classical style." So that he did recognize. So then, with the resolution of style, the principal buildings of this new city started to be built. Foremost, of course, amongst this was Rashtrapati Bhavan, and this was going to be the center of the city around which the whole city was going to be built. Rashtrapati Bhavan is flanked by the Secretariat buildings, and the forecourt leads to Kingsway, now called Rajpath, all the way down. And it was this huge ceremonial path or road that Lutyens had planned. And this building has 340 rooms and loggias of varying sizes. The two main fronts are 640 feet wide, and where South and North Court is, they are 540 feet, and it's 4-storied high, and it was very imperial in the scale in which it was created. From Hindu and Mughal architecture, Lutyens took many things. There were many vernacular idioms which he used. He took the chhajjas, he took the chhatris, and he also created these loggias with, he also created, can we go back? He also created these loggias that run right around the whole building, and they kind of mask the fenestration and mask the door openings, and they form a very strong repetitive theme that runs right around this massive and rather magnificent building. Jalis, as we can see on the left-hand side, these are the jalis of the doors that lead to the Mughal gardens. And this he took from the Red Fort, actually. So if you can see that on the screen, it is descriptive of what he was taking. He also he had to be impressed by Fatehpur Sikri, because he copied the strong banding of color and texture that is used in Akbar's Fatehpur Sikri. And these bands of red sandstone and bands of cream Dholpur stone, they accentuated this vast horizontality of this building. Feature in Rashtrapati Bhavan is really the dome. And this is a copper hemisphere that rises from a white drum, which is incised by this railing, and both inspired by Sanchi, which, as you know, is 200 AD, BC. And that's Sanchi with the dome and its railings that run around it. And beneath the dome is the 80-foot-high Darbar Hall. And for this, there are 4 apses in it, which were directly inspired by the Pantheon in Rome, the 2nd century AD Pantheon, which he deeply admired. Now, there were many motifs which were Indian, integrally Indian, that Lutyens used. One was the cobra, which is this bronze cobra, which is part of the fountain in the South Court. And then he used elephants for gate posts, entry to the basement, and they're all engraved in stone and magnificently done. And he had to have been influenced by the pair of elephants at the Delhi Darwaza in Lal Killa or Red Fort. There are 250 acres which were assigned for the Mughal gardens, and these were laid out like Mughal gardens are, with their pools, their fountains, and running water. And this is a plan, and in the plan you see the sunken garden, and this he designed so that the viceroys could entertain noble ladies in Parda. I thought that was very charming to have thought things through to that extent. And this is what he did. And then, but there were also several other architects who were working. His main collaborator was Herbert Baker. And this elevation and this actual photograph really show what led to the Battle of the Gradient, but that's another story, and which Lutyens lost to Baker. So he always called it his Bakerloo and never spoke to Baker after that. And this is Baker's South Block. And Baker also designed the Parliament House. So the Colosseum design of it was suggested by Lutyens. He did Hyderabad House, and this was for the Nawab of Hyderabad, then the richest man in the world, and of course Bill Gates and all hadn't arrived. And this is Mr. Muhammad Ali Jinnah's residence. Lutyens laid the foundation stone. It was of course done by the Bloomfield brothers, who worked in Lutyens's office. And the architects like Sir Robert Orr Russell went into the building of New Delhi. This is Connaught Place, then the best designed commercial center in the world, and which he based on Bath. And this is the Murthy House, which used to be Flagstaff House, and where the first Prime Minister, that is Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, resided. But speaking, when it came to staff bungalows, then Lutyens' designs were considered too expensive, and Baker's designs were selected, which Lutyens called bungalows, spelt BUNGLE-OHS. But isn't it ironical that today this whole bungalow area is called the Lutyens Bungalow Zone? In any case, so Lutyens was, Lutyens was given the prize commission of designing the All India War Memorial, which today we call India. It's massive, it's 170 feet high, it has names of all the fallen soldiers who fell during the First World War. And India Gate has these huge pine cones, again, superbly carved by master craftsmen. But he took that design from the Vatican in Rome. He also did the George V Memorial, which today is called the Chhatri. And so New Delhi was named in 1926 and inaugurated in 1931. And speaking about the naming of the city, one of Lutyens' office people recollects that it had been a sweltering May afternoon and sweat was pouring from their face, and they were trying to decide on a name, and names like George Poor, George Paw, as they would have pronounced it, and Mary Paw were being bandied around. And because, as you know, it's a suffix used in India for Jaipur, Rampur, and Aurangabad, Ahmedabad, etc. And Lutyens, bored out of his mind, just shoots up and says, "Let's call it Uzipo." There was stunned silence, and the meeting immediately broke up, and no other name than New Delhi was ever suggested again. So that is the naming of the city. And
Sunita, but can I, with your permission, can we now, because we've got only half an hour left, can we move on to some of the questions that have arisen from your presentation? Yes, certainly.
This is the last thing. This is a Mughal style miniature done by Marjorie Shoesmith, whose husband worked in Lutyens' office, and it shows Lutyens presenting the key of Viceroy's house to Lord Irwin. His wife, Lady Irwin, sits above in Parda, and behind Lutyens are Baker and the chief architect, the chief engineer. And of course, it was visited by many, many people. Mountbattens left in 1948, and Lutyens is best. He always said that architecture is, if you have wit, you can design great architecture. This is his bust. He incorporated his spectacles into ventilators of the basement, into the walls of the Mughal gardens, and this is a vista. And this has been described by a very noted architectural historian. The sadness for the British was, or rather ironical, that this came when the imperial impulse was faltering, because after New Delhi was inaugurated in 1931, and as we all know, we became independent in 1947. So all I can say is I hope that this amazing legacy will be conserved and preserved for future generations.
Yeah, can I just ask you, the unsung person, the person whose name has not emerged in this is Colonel Jacob Swinton.
Yes.
Who's left his mark in various places. For example, on our side of the border, Ashton College, Peshawar Museum, and then on your side, the Deity College in Indore, and then the more spectacular Lakshmi Nivas Palace at Bikaner, whom and Swinton Jacob loved this Indo-Saracenic style of the cupolas and the domes, etc. So much so that Lady Harding, at that time the wife of the Viceroy, described him as a walking directory on Indian decoration. Would you like to just mention what his contribution was in the final designs and in the finesse of the buildings?
Not in these central government buildings, because apart from drafting some, which is all recorded, but the design of these is basically Renaissance architecture. It is Palladian. And Rashtrapati Bhavan is considered the last Renaissance palace, apart from having been the largest built in the last 100 years. But they did many other buildings. I mean, Swinton, I think, has also done a building in Dehradun. I can't recollect the name of it. But because there were many architects who were attracted to New Delhi because of this new capital being built. But most of them were really kind of acolytes of Lutyens and the style that he was proposing for it.
Absolutely. Can I also quickly touch upon, there were about 29,000 workers who were involved on this expanse. Would you like to talk about the quality of the workmanship of these unsung heroes who established New Delhi, who created New Delhi?
Aijaz, I'm so glad that you've listed all these big contractors who worked on this building, because I do not think Delhi could have been built without them and what they contributed. So it was one thing to design, it was another thing to actually construct. But, you know, India has always had the largest number of craftsmen of any country in the world. And one of the great craft traditions that we have is working in stonework. We've had it for several hundred years. So these were the people who were brought from their villages to actually work on the stone cutting, because one must realize that there's very little steel and cement which has been used in the making of, say, Rashtrapati Bhavan, whereas I think that 2 million tons of stone that has been used, and all this had to be cut apart from the carvers. So all this was being done. Another thing is, even then when it came to the interiors, all the panel work, all the superb woodwork that exists was also done by Tarkhans from here. And you know, and I showed a map which is 1900, and they came from Lahore also. Wonderful. I mean, this is all recorded history, that the people who worked on the craftsmen who worked on Rashtrapati Bhavan and these buildings.
And you also mentioned that the carpets were woven at jails in Agra.
So, yes, the jail in Agra, in Amritsar, in Lahore. These jail carpets are really pretty magnificent, actually.
Now, all of this costs money. And what I find remarkable is that what started off as a total estimate of £6 million paid for out of Indian revenues, but nevertheless £6 million between up to 1916, 1.25 million had been in fact expended. But what I find remarkable is that in between this time, you had the 1914-18 war, when there must have been a demand on resources other than the completion of what was a very grandiose scheme of imperial, without being unfair, imperial pretension. They wanted to establish the imperial stamp on India. And then by March 1921, Government House is 1/3 finished, Secretariat is almost 1/5 finished, 2/5 finished. So there was it was working at a fast pace, but nevertheless it cost money. What was the final cost of the whole enterprise?
I think it went up by 2.5 times, if I recollect, to what was the initial. Actually, it started with 4 million, and then there was a slight increase, and then I think it went up by 2.5 times the cost. I mean, it became because the First World War also is the principal reason that the cost went up, and also alongside materials were costing more, and therefore if you see in Baker's Parliament House, the top floor, the top band is left in plaster. It was originally to have been clad in stone. So then these were sort of austerity measures that they were employing.
You made a brilliant presentation on the construction of New Delhi, on Lutyens' contribution to it, and of course Baker's lesser, in my mind, a lesser contribution. It was more functional compared to Lutyens', which was on an imperial scale. And then you rather mischievously have also included the Queen Mary's doll's house, which he designed. It was a complete reversal. That was why.
As you had mentioned it, and you said that,
Yes,
what did he do after, but
yes,
actually he was doing alongside. I mean, the man
that's
was a
right. Yes,
genius. He was a colonialist, but he was also fun-loving. And the fact is, I remember when um, he was also fun-loving. And he, as I said earlier, he had complete originality of mind. I mean, there wasn't one
yeah,
mundane thought that came to him.
absolutely. Even to the children's nursery, where he
Yes,
had designed the lamps, and
the
the light bulbs
chandeliers.
were like eggs, and with the yolk of the egg, etc.
Yes.
Many years ago, I mean, this is a story that actually occurred. Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, Prime Minister, first Prime Minister of your country, was hosting Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister
Mhm.
of the Great Britain. And they were
Yes.
both classicists in their own way. And Nehru turned to Macmillan and he said, "Do you think the Romans ever revisited their colonies, their former colonies?" And
Mhm.
that completely won over Harold Macmillan because
Mhm.
here was this person who could see beyond the perimeters of history, the horizon of history. Now,
Yes.
did
Yes.
Lutyens ever then revisit New Delhi after he had finished?
Yes, he did. He came for the
Mhm.
inauguration. He came with Edward Hudson, who was then the very powerful publisher of Country Life, and who
Mhm.
published everything that Lutyens designed, and therefore
Right.
also that also increased his popularity. He came back in 1941 because there were alarming reports that Lady Willingdon was making changes to Rashtrapati Bhavan and adding chintz and all that, which he hated. I mean, he hated chintzy sofas with frills at the bottom and all that. And in fact, he wrote to her and he said, "Madam, if you had the Parthenon to design, you would add bow windows to it."
Oh,
So yeah,
that's,
so he
yeah.
wrote that to her. So he arrived to set right what Lady Willingdon was doing. And as you know, I mean, he came, he worked on that, and his son took more photographs, which are today all on loan to the Royal Institute of British Architects, and some of which I showed. And these are 31 photographs, but he also took photographs in 41. And and he died in 1944. He's known as the last great traditionalist. And even
Mm.
though the modern movement had started whilst he was working, but he kind of remained distant from it.
Mm.
And he will
Well,
always be, sorry,
Mhm. No, you were
he will,
saying.
and for a short time, his architectural reputation did go into kind of disuse. But today it is back again very, very
Mm.
strongly as to what, and he's considered one of the greatest architects that the 20th century produced.
Thank you, Sunita, for a wonderful,
Thank you
wonderfully
so much,
stimulating
Ejaz.
presentation.
I've been so delighted to be discussing this with you. And thank you, Razi, for inviting me to the Lahore Literary Festival.